the concept of restoration, as most of you will know, really deals to all of these different dilemmas that we're facing today. And these are things that aren't happening just out there in the rest of the world, but they're in our corner of the globe as well. And they're things that we need to think about down here in Aotearoa. So the first question I'm going to pose to you is, where have our forests gone? When you go traveling, you look out your window of the car or the plane or the bus, and this is what you usually see now in our country. There's a lot of introduced pasture grasses, and there are a lot of monocultures of tree plantations. So this is probably Pinus radiata that we're looking at in the background here, back here. And so there are a few little remnants of native vegetation on the landscape, but for the most part, we have a very different landscape from what we used to. According to Manaki Whenua's threatened environment classification, we actually have a lot of red on the map. Now, red is the areas where there's less than 10% of our indigenous cover left on the landscape. And you will notice where the red occurs is around where our cities are. And I have stars here for where we are right now, of course, but also where People, Cities, and Nature, our research program, does other research in the North Island. And we also do work in the South Island, and I'll talk about that later on. You'll also notice that a lot of these areas are either in lowland or coastal zones. So, okay, our indigenous forest is greatly reduced from the cover it used to have, but why does this really matter? Why should we care? Well, our ecosystem services are greatly reduced as well, and these are what we think of as the benefits that we get from indigenous forest areas. So clean drinking water, decomposition of waste, food from plants, etc. And it's a very long list, and the more research that's occurring around the world, the longer the list gets of these crucial ecosystem services that we need. And the more research that occurs, the more we realize these services come from, most efficiently, from intact natural areas. So actually, we can assign a dollar value to our native forest. It's not just ecosystem services, though. There's these things that are very helpful as ecosystem services go, but there's also a lot of social benefits from having beautiful native areas and indigenous forests on the landscape. In the city context, people are much more likely to have social cohesion if there are nice green spaces to go for a run, walk their dog, talk to their neighbors. And we know that that sense of community is really important to our well-being as individuals and as a group. Additionally, the health and recreation benefits are manifold times greater if we have green spaces in our cities and indigenous landscapes, because we can get out there and tramp and run, and it's much nicer, and you're more likely to if you have a nice green space than if you just have a motorway to run along. And of course, if we can conserve and restore, we can preserve our unique natural heritage for future generations. And this is important especially here because we have interesting plants and animals that you can't find anywhere else in the world. This is a paper that came out recently that I wanted to share with you. It's called Strategically Growing the Urban Forest Will Improve Our World. And in this study, the researcher looked at the value of trees in the urban landscape. And they looked at 10 megacities, which are listed here, and were able to calculate that a square kilometer of tree cover could save an average of $83 per city resident every year. So this is under a lot of different categories, but the main ones are listed here. All these wonderful ecosystem services where we actually can put trees on the landscape and relieve the burden on other infrastructure that we have to maintain and build and use. And so one of the big ones here, Tokyo, the city that benefited the most from tree cover, for example, saved a lot of money because air pollution gives our health system a lot of costs at times because of all of the particulate matter in cities that can bother our respiratory systems. And so a few trees actually in the landscape can help cut down those medical costs. So now my question to you is New Zealand benefiting from urban forests as much as it could? Especially after we looked at that map with all the red on it. Now I'm going to bring another thread into this discussion, which is the idea or the concept of restoration ecology, which we all have heard of. We're going to dig a little deeper into it. So how it's usually largely defined is restoration ecology is a scientific study of repairing disturbed ecosystems through human intervention. And I want to distinguish between restoration ecology and conservation biology, which is more to do with focusing on preventing ongoing degradation. So both are good. Conservation is about stopping ongoing degradation. Restoration ecology, you have to be a little bit more of an optimist because you have to say, this is really degraded, but we can change that. We can make it better again, make it whole. So now I'm going to bring in this idea of, well, what if we can bring back forests in our urban areas? And this isn't new, it's not my idea. It's actually happening all around the world in response to all this research that's showing how beneficial it is, and also because we have a lot of city growth everywhere. So it is estimated that about 64% of the world's population will be in cities by 2050. So why not make those nice places to live and efficient and places that we can take care of people and let them have a good quality of life? In New Zealand, we're ahead of the curve. Look how many of us live in cities. A lot. So this says to me, what better reason than to put a lot of green spaces and a lot of forests into our cities and make them wonderful places to live, high quality places to live. So traditionally, ecologists, and even in the background of my training, we've been taught, oh, well, cities are just a problem. There's lots of pollution and people, and it's terrible for animals and plants. But actually, I don't think that's true. And a lot of people are asking this question now. Well, what if we view cities not as an actual problem, but a solution instead? And I'm becoming more and more convinced of this. Because in cities, we can promote biodiversity. We can make these beautiful green spaces for recreation. We already have them. We can make them even better and make more of them. We can get these ecosystem services that we realize are so vital. And if we have beautiful indigenous green spaces in our cities, right on people's doorstep, they will be advocates for those places on their doorstep and those far away that they may not know. But you can only care about what you know. And a lot of people never leave their city. They don't go out into the national parks. So now I'm going to run through a few of the key differences, ecological and social differences, between restoring in a rural setting and restoring in an urban setting, because they're very different in some aspects. So first of all, cities. It's like they are the meccas of disturbance, ecologically speaking. The soil is quite altered. The climate's different. There's the urban heat island, which affects a lot of animals and plants. And there's every pollutant known to man in cities. There's also a lot of habitat fragmentation. So that makes it difficult for animals and plants to move around the landscape, propagate their genes, and have a functioning ecosystem. Also, we all know how many different weeds and pests and interesting new creatures exist on the city landscape. Often it's the port of call for new invasive species, right? They arrive on a plane or a boat, and that's where they get started. So we have to kind of work that into the equation when we're restoring in cities. And sometimes seedless is good, but not so much on the city landscape. So there's a lack of native plant propagules and seeds in cities, which is not an insurmountable barrier. It's just something we need to acknowledge and plan for. There's also these interesting social differences. Sometimes people who live in urban areas don't always have the ecological knowledge or social acceptance of having green areas or forest right next to them. It's kind of something that they see as, oh, we need to have that far away out. Nature doesn't belong near us, and we don't want to have it near us. And there's varied values to consider in the discussion around restoration about, well, what do we all want? There can also be human-wildlife conflicts, and this happens more overseas, but we have had a bit of it here. Like, for instance, a few years ago, this photo is from kind of a media event down in Wellington. I don't know if anyone remembers, but Zealandia had wonderful success with its kaka, and they were flying over the fence into people's yards and enjoying some of their trees, and their fruit trees especially in their gardens. And they were being very cheeky. And some people didn't mind. They thought this is great, but some people were bothered by this. And so it resulted in a little bit of demonization of the kaka. So this is something to keep in mind, is we say, yeah, we love wild things, we love our nature, but then be prepared because it might arrive and may have consequences that you have to deal with. And then finally, in cities, as we all know, there are multiple stakeholders. So there are a few more of us than maybe in rural areas who are contributing to the discussion, and we all want to have a better place to live and have different things to kind of add to that discussion about what it would look like. Okay, so I'm going to summarize some of what I see and our program sees as general keys to success. First of all, we've found that it's really helpful to move from a revegetation mindset to a restoration mindset, because it lets you, as a community, capture all of the benefits, all of the ecosystem services that you can get. It's not just about putting green things back on the landscape, but it's about building an ecosystem that's a living, functioning ecosystem. Also, to patiently and respectfully work together. And this, for me, has been a huge lesson in running this program, because I've been working with people all across New Zealand in different city councils and regional councils. And it's amazing the different perspectives on how to get something done. And I've learned a lot, really, and it has been really beneficial, but it takes patience, definitely. And then finally, we find that it's really great to use scientific underpinning in order to be efficient with restoration work and to ultimately achieve long-term success. So if you're looking to restore a forest, you have to think like a forest. You have to think on the order of not just decades, but centuries. When we think about ecology, there are these three main realms, if you will. So there's this big body of theory up here that the academics talk about and debate ideas and do experiments and that sort of thing. And then restoration ecology is kind of nestled under that umbrella, and it's an offshoot of ecological theory, where it's a scientific process of continuing to develop theory, but then also learning from restoration that's happened to continue to advance restoration practice. And then there's ecological restoration itself, which is the people who are doing the hard yards on the ground, doing the practitioner work, right? So nobody in the system can exist without the others. Everybody plays a crucial role, and it's a two-way road. So we all learn from the other realms involved in restoration ecology, and then we give and participate that way. Okay, so with these keys in mind and this framework in mind, why don't we do it? Why don't we progress urban forest restoration by linking the theory to the practice and then learning from it, from what happens? So an example I wanted to put forward of this is using the theory of succession, or a succession framework. So this is the idea ecologically that there are certain plants, certain pioneer species, and early colonizing species of plants that can survive on a degraded landscape. They're really tough plants, they can handle the exposed conditions, and they do really well if you put them in first, right? But then there are other plant species who they're late successional. They'll just die if you put them in right away. But if you plant them under a canopy, they'll thrive and do really well. And they're actually really important, vital aspects of the forest ecosystem. So you want to have that whole suite of species, but got to get the timing right for when they're introduced. And the idea is we're mimicking nature when we do restoration. So if there's a volcanic explosion, then there's a whole blank slate, like a landscape that's just been wiped clean. And we've studied those and we see which plant species come back first. And then in restoration, we can just kind of mimic that and put the same sort of species back first on our blank slate, however it was cleared, and then add other species later when the conditions are right. And then another pool of theory that we can draw on when we're doing restoration work is looking into plant competition and timing of weed control. So knowing what plants are going to compete with others and which ones aren't either, so you don't have to worry about them. And then also when to control weeds and how to do it to most efficiently manage your budget and achieve the goal that you want. So now I'm going to introduce the People, Cities, and Nature Research Program, which I am part of, as Bruce discussed earlier. And I'm part of the Urban Plantings Research aim. But we do have 6 different aims. We have 3 more ecologically orientated aims here, these bubbles. So this is my one that I'm going to talk about today. But then we also have 3 social science bubbles or research aims. And this is because doing urban restoration is not just about nature, and it's not just about people. It's about connecting them for mutual benefit. We work in 9 different cities for the green plantings bubble that I am involved with. And we work across a number of different institutions. I know this is small, sorry. But the idea is this is a very large collaborative program. And we are learning to work together as a team in that sense, as well as with stakeholders and end users like yourselves. So here's a little bit more description about the program. And this is all on our website. So if you just Google People, Cities, and Nature, you can find more information. And here's what I'm going to talk about today. But later today, we have Neil up, and he's going to talk about the Predators Research aim. So you can hear what's happening there. Here are the people involved with the research aim that I work in, the plantings aim. And we have 4 wonderful leaders and students. And the students are amazing. They get a lot of credit. They do a lot of hard work. And there's no way the program could run without them. And this is Sarah. She couldn't make it today, but she's the student who is responsible for Tauranga. So she's collected a lot of the data here. Diane's met her, and I think probably more of you will meet her in future because we're not finished and she'll be back. This is where our program sits. People, Cities, and Nature is committed to being a bridge. So we have people who are trained in ecological theory, and we connect with people like yourselves and many others all around the country who are doing restoration work. And we're trying to learn from what you're doing and help to give you feedback on that and give you answers and hopefully be that effective bridge. So what do? We have 2 objectives. And what we do is we have a chronosequence set up of plots across the whole country to answer our objectives. A chronosequence is essentially an age gradient of planted forests, because we can't just plant a forest and come back in 70 years and measure it. So instead, we have found forest patches in cities all around the country that were planted by others, and they range from 4 to 5 years old to, I think, our oldest one's about 58 years old. And this lets us study how these forests grow over time. And then we can kind of get a handle on the dynamics of the forests. Are they doing what we want, or are they not? And how can we manage them to achieve that restored forest ecosystem that we want, that gives us all the benefits? So the first objective is all about regeneration. What we ultimately would like to see is a forest that we've put in place, there's a canopy, and it starts to self-perpetuate. Because that is a sign that you have built a successfully self-perpetuating forest, not just a garden that you have to maintain forever and pour resources into forever. So to study regeneration, we're looking at that temporal dynamic. A young forest, maybe that you've just planted, you can't even call it a forest, it's just a few trees here and there, right, in the grass. But that grows, and at some point it becomes something that looks like a forest, so what happens in between? Is that connected to the climate? Is that more connected to what species you plant? What are the most important factors that make that happen? And we reckon, based on the literature and talking with a lot of other people, that the indicator that you have successfully restored a forest patch is if you see native trees regenerating under the canopy, ones that you have not planted, they're coming up all on their own, and epiphytes colonizing, which are just the plants that can grow on trees. And the reason that these are a great index of your success is that they're very sensitive to the microclimate and to conditions in the forest itself. So if they're growing, you did something right. So one of our key questions is, well, what is driving that regeneration to happen? If that's the key, we want those plants to regenerate and to grow and to colonize. Well, what's causing it? We know, okay, the age of the forest is probably important, but it could be connected to all of these other different ecosystem properties. And so what I'm showing you here is an example of what we'll be doing with all the data that we're collecting all around the country right now. This is from another study, and this was looking at some of what we found in that case in Hamilton and New Plymouth to be really key ecosystem properties that significantly mathematically caused these things to occur. We started to see lots more epiphytes and lots more trees regenerating if soil temperatures were stabilized, humidity levels became stable, and the herbaceous weeds were minimal or gone. And the key was canopy openness. So I'll dig into that a little bit more here. So here, it's the same study, and it's the same approach we're going to use for our nationwide study, where we look at the time since restoration. So that's on the axis, the x-axis for all of these plots. And then we look at these different key ecosystem properties on the y-axis, and we see how they're related. And this allows us to make predictions about how forests will change, and not just of the shape of the line and the relationship between the age of the forest and the ecosystem properties, but when things start to happen. So for example, in this study, we found this interesting point, a threshold, a critical threshold happening, that around 20 years, the canopy dropped, the canopy openness dropped. So essentially, those trees, the crowns of the trees filled in, they're all hungrily trying to get the light, right? They form that ceiling of the forest. And when that happens, at about 20 years, humidity starts to stabilize, which is really important for our indicators of success, our tree regeneration. Soil temperature starts to stabilize, and herbaceous weeds, they can't cut it, right? Because there's no sunlight getting to the forest floor anymore. And so that's great because they compete with native tree seedlings. So what we're learning is we can manage forest ecosystems so that they will successfully cross these thresholds. It's just important to get your timing right, and you can kind of manage and bump that forest over into the more stable state, help it along that journey. We're doing our research in 9 different cities that are spread across a latitudinal gradient, and this is to help us capture the climate differences, because we also know that climate really strongly affects plant growth. I think we all know that, but we wanted to dig deeper and find out, well, how? So we're doing research up here, where we are today, all the way down into Invercargill. We have plots there as well, where we're measuring the same things in restored forests. We have 9 plots in every city, so that gives us 81 altogether to work with in our analysis. And all of our plots are in native forest that's been planted from scratch, usually from agricultural use of some sort. All right, so how about here? Home sweet home, right? Here's where we have our plots in Tauranga. They're all permanent plots all around the country. So this study is intended to continue for as long as possible, to continue following these plots in these forests and see how they grow and change. And we can rediscover these plots with a special kind of a treasure map. They're usually not very obvious to people who would just be walking past, and that's what we want, because we want them to remain undisturbed. They're generally on public land, again, because they're meant to be permanent, so we don't need a changeover of hands or ownership. And here in Tauranga, they range from a 5-year-old planting to one that was planted 31 years ago. And I definitely want to give a shout out to Diane, because we couldn't have found these without her help. It was absolutely crucial. I'm going to walk through where they are on a close-up level now, so you can point to the ones that you have been to, or you know, or maybe you didn't know they were there and you work there all the time, who knows. And I'm also going to show you the ages, so you can see this age gradient. You can see that we've purposely selected these different ages so that we can study forests to see how they're changing over time. Here's our oldest one, at McArdle's bush. And this is where we're going to go today on our field trip. So hopefully, most all of you can make it along to that, because we can actually talk about what we see there. We'll go visit the plot and make some observations about things. Hopefully, I've raised some discussion with this presentation, and we can talk about it more. Okay, so what are we actually doing in these plots? What are we measuring? We look at the topographic index, and basically this is just something that lets us calculate where the plot lies in the landscape. It has to do with slope, and it's related to drainage and sunlight exposure. So these are two things that can really affect regeneration of native plants. So that's something that we can put into that big mathematical model that I showed you and see if it actually is important, mathematically or not. We do veg surveys. So we look at the composition of the forest. We measure all of the adult trees to calculate the basal area, and that's the essentially the cross-section area of each tree, like how wide the tree is per hectare. And we tally all of the seedlings that are regenerating, and we identify them as well to find out what do we have coming up and how much of it. We also estimate the amount of herbaceous ground cover, because this is definitely key in that dynamic of do we have regeneration or not, because it's so competitive. A lot of our non-native weeds that are herbaceous are pretty tough. We look at the canopy openness, because as I showed you before, that's a pretty big driving factor in the conditions under that forest ceiling. And that's not just light availability, but that's those microclimate conditions, so the humidity, the air temperature, the soil temperature. The canopy openness actually affects all of those a lot. So speaking of which, we're measuring the microclimate as well. To do that, we have little data loggers like this. They're called eye buttons. We bury them in the ground at 10 centimeters depth, and they are programmed to take a snapshot measurement of the temperature every 4 hours. And we're doing this for a whole year. So they're out there just logging right now. And this lets us capture all annual cycles of temperature in the soil. We have hobos that look like this. They're data loggers that are collecting every 4 hours measurements of air humidity and air temperature. And so again, that will give us the whole annual cycle. So we can have both of these metrics and be able to say, okay, well, here's what we found growing here. Here's what the microclimate looked like. And look at the relationship in all these 81 plots across the country and find out what makes it tick along, basically. Our plots look like this. Well, conceptually. Hopefully you can't see anything when you go visit one of our plots, or not much of anything. They're 10 meters by 20 meters in dimension, and we measure and identify all of the adult trees in the plot, all of the saplings in these lettered subplots, the square ones, and then all the seedlings in these little circular plots. And then the data loggers are located at the center of the plot and then also at the corner as well. That's partly for redundancy because you never know when a data logger may give up the ghost or when an interesting passerby does find it and decide to take it home, which can happen from time to time. So all of our plots are set up. We did that last summer all across the country. We deployed all the data loggers. We tagged and identified almost 4,000 trees in the whole study. And for Tauranga here, we are on schedule for this round of data collection to be finished in February, because those data loggers are still out there ticking away. So we don't know about the microclimate data yet. However, we do have our forest composition preliminary data analysis underway. So that's what I'm going to show you next, a little snapshot. Okay, I'm going to start with tree basal area. So if you remember, that is essentially the area of the tree if you were to do a cross-section of the tree. And that's adding all of the area of all the trees up per plot and calculating that on a square meters per hectare level. So that's shown here on the y-axis. And then on the x-axis, you can see forest age. Can you see my cursor? No, you can't. Okay. So, and then each of these points is one of the plots in Tauranga and the value for basal area. And you can see the names there because I'm sure that you'd like to look at the value for the one that you know the best, maybe. So what's the general trend here? Apparently, as forests get older, trees get bigger, which is not rocket science. But I'll get to my point soon. You'll see something new that you won't be like, duh. If we look at canopy openness, which is on the y-axis here, for the same set of plots, we see the general trend is, okay, as forests get older, we see a drop, which is what we want. I'm really happy to see that, because it means the trees are growing successfully. Maybe some are dying, but for the most part, they're surviving and growing and filling in the canopy so that the lay is dropping. For herbaceous ground cover, things are a little all over the show. This guy's a bit of an outlier. Might be a management thing, I don't know. But yeah, pretty low levels, which is generally good. And then tree seedling regeneration is still kind of oscillating depending on the age of the forest. So, okay, those are the basics. Now what I'm going to do is show you the same data, but a couple new things thrown in. Ready? Napier's in here now. Because remember, we've been doing these vegetation composition surveys all over the country. So Napier is shown in red. I'm just throwing it in there so you can look at another city and compare it with Tauranga. And then I've also put in a linear regression model. So this is basically just showing you what would be the perfect fit if there's a perfect relationship between these two variables, and then the acceptable spread on either side for that model. So just to guide us to kind of think about patterns here, right? Because that's what we're looking for in this ecological research. We're looking for patterns so we can make predictions so that we can manage things efficiently. So here we have this really nice pattern, predictable pattern, drop in canopy openness as forests age. And you can imagine that as we're adding New Plymouth and Hamilton and Wellington and Nelson, we're going to get more and more dots on these graphs. And we're going to get smoother and nicer and more truer lines so that we can really see strong patterns of how these relationships pan out. Herbaceous ground cover follows canopy openness in this big drop. Not a surprise because lesser light, lesser weeds. There's a few interesting little outliers here, so the model is kind of a little bit warped. And so I was kind of wondering, oh, what's going on with this guy? Because it's a pretty young forest, but it's got really low ground cover, which is quite interesting. So then I said, okay, well, let's look back at canopy openness. Here's the same site. It's got pretty high canopy openness. So again, I think this maybe it could be a management thing that's happening because you would predict maybe more herbaceous ground cover, maybe. And then for tree seedling regeneration, okay, we're seeing this lovely upward trend, which is what we want. This is our, like, you've made it. You're successful if you've got your forest regenerating itself because it's going to self-perpetuate. Then you don't have to plant it over and over again. You don't have to maintain it in every little tiny aspect. There's something else going on here. Remember those critical thresholds? Well, I think we're starting to see a hint of them just with these two cities. And it's at about the same point. It's at around the 20-year mark. We're seeing a threshold which is largely triggered by basal area and canopy openness. And this is very exciting because it's helping us to understand more about the dynamics of the forests and make those predictions that I was talking about, so that then we can say, oh, look, this is predictably going to happen at this point in the lifespan of a forest, so you can plan for it as you manage it. I also put these big orange blobs on here to help you just to compare with what values you'd find in an urban forest remnant. So a place that hasn't been restored, it's just a remnant of trees, a forest that's been on the landscape for a while. So kind of what we could think of as our target or our reference ecosystem. So for basal area, you would typically find it max out around 100 square meters per hectare. So we're getting there. The site in Napier has got some pretty big trees growing already at about 37 years old, I think. And then canopy openness way down here. And this is, we've all gone for a walk in the forest, in a mature forest, and you realize it's a lot less exposed, right? You're walking under that canopy and the conditions are suddenly very different. So it's not a surprise. There's very little canopy openness and it's low value. For herbaceous ground cover, it follows the same trend. Not a lot of light, not a lot of herbaceous plants growing. And if we look at an urban forest remnant and we measure the seedlings, they're off the charts. I couldn't even put them on the side because they're way up here. So we've got a long way to go, I think, to see that, that level of regeneration in our restored forests. But that's okay because there's typically a lag. So after you've done these things and you see your forest maturing, eventually your tree seedlings are going to start growing and get more and more and more dense, which is what you want. So a big take home here is just remember it takes more than one generation to do this. This is a big quest to rebuild these forests, but it's one that we can certainly do. We just have to be prepared to hand over that responsibility to the next generation and help them understand why and how. The second thing that we do, the second objective, which won't take as long as the first, don't worry, is called enrichment. So first one was regeneration. How do we get our native plants to regenerate on their own? What conditions drive that? But also we want to learn how can we experimentally test how to facilitate this succession theory or succession framework by actually planting enrichment plants, late successional plants, or I've started to call them affectionately Goldilocks plants, because these are the plants that don't like it too cold, they don't like it too hot, they don't like it too dry, but they are vital to the forest ecosystem. They're pillars of the forest ecosystem. So we need to get them established, but we have to figure out, well, what are these conditions that they need? When do we plant them? Typically, there's no seed bank for these, and in rural areas, there can be, and so you can let them spontaneously regenerate. But in city areas, there often are no viable seeds left. So it's something that we need to think about. Okay, well, they're not going to just come back on their own that way. And oftentimes, because of habitat fragmentation, they won't be delivered by seed dispersers either, by birds or even sometimes by wind. So we can't count on that. An example of that is this little schematic. You may have forest patches scattered across your city that look like this. And for the most part, propules are getting around, seeds are getting dispersed by birds or whatever. But there's some sort of an impediment on the landscape. And this forest patch is not getting enriched at all. There's no way for those late successional seed sources to get there. So that's where we come in. As restoration practitioners and scientists, we need to recognize when that's happening and step in and fill the void. So this experiment kind of gets at that goal. And we've planted some late successional species into our forest plots to see what they like, what makes them establish. We've planted rimu, kawakawa, and akapuka, guzelinia. And this one's an epiphyte. So I had a lot of fun because I've never planted a plant on a tree before. And that's what we did here. We actually tied these into the trees in our plots. And this is what it looks like. So we're using the exact same plot layout and just adding these enrichment species in, kind of in this pattern that you see here. Okay, so that's it for that experiment. I'm going to wrap it up now because I've taken a little while to get through this. But I just want you to potentially get out your phone to snap a couple photos, because I'm going to put up some slides with some general tips and some resources. So this can let you have a reference for later if you want. So first of all, it's very important to make a plan with clear goals and steps. And this is, remember, we're thinking like a forest, so it's not just, unfortunately, it's not always right in tandem with our budget plans and that sort of thing. It's more thinking in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, in 100 years, where is this going to be successionally? What do we want this place to look like? Is this forest going to be a forest? Is it on that trajectory? Remember to plant successionally. So those early pioneering species are crucial. They're going to get you to the critical threshold where you have a canopy, and then you get to plant the enrichment species, the Goldilocks species that are fussy, but wow, once you get them established, they're the pillars of that forest, and they're going to take it long term. And plant natives. I say this because a native plant or tree will tick way more ecosystem service boxes than a non-native will. So we're not thinking about just carbon sequestration or just air pollution. We're thinking about herbivorous insects that have co-evolved with our native plants, and they're bird food. That's what our birds feed their young. Not so much nectar, they feed them insect protein. So we need to support them. Also, plant the right plant in the right place. Just think about ecologically, where does this plant belong? On a slope, down in a wet area, in the sun, in the shade. Plant densely. This is painful because I know it's expensive to do. But if you're thinking like a forest and thinking long term, you're going to get weed reduction and suppression and a canopy in place way faster if you plant densely. So just patiently working in small areas, densely planting and adding over the years. And then herbaceous weed control. It can be helpful in that beginning to kind of get you to that threshold, but really getting the canopy closed is a much less expensive, less invasive way to get that herbaceous plant control. So you maybe just wanted to have that occurring in moderation in the beginning, and then hopefully you can plan for that not to have to happen after a while. And then you'll be doing planting and other kinds of maintenance. And then monitor what happens and adapt. You know, so improving the process, learning from what you're doing. Do you like it? Do you not like it? And then changing. Here are some resources that we've put together I can recommend to help you if you're interested in learning more about this or how to do this. So we have a handout that has a whole bunch of websites you can go to for practical steps and guidance and inspiration or whatever. And it's also on our website. So if you go to our website, you can click on the digital version of this handout. And it has things that are specific we put on there for the Bay of Plenty. If you feel like you are trying to restore and you don't know how, this is a global effort. And there's a society here, the International Society for Ecological Restoration. You can go there and see people all around the world who are learning. You can look at this guide, the International Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration. That's really really helpful. And then if you want, this organization has just approved a process for becoming a certified restoration practitioner. So you can go to the website and learn how to do that. And this is such a growing field all around the world. I think people are really going to be excited to be getting certified. I just met some people last week, actually, who have just gotten that certification. And they said it was really good. And then I'll just leave you with this. If you want to do something to make a positive impact, you can go to Working Bees, go to the Nature Space website to find out about volunteering opportunities. And then finally, make your voice heard. If you like what I talked about today, write it down in a submission, and if you want to have some forests back, you can let them know so that they can allocate the right funds for that. So with that, I'd like to thank all of our partnering councils all across the entire country, and thank you for your time, and I'll take any questions.